So, I'd like to demonstrate some aspects of the workflow service by taking you through the demo workflow that I used and put together for writing my Discovering SAP Cloud Platform workflow series. And that relates to beer. I use the Untapped website and the Untapped app to check in my the beers that I drink and rate them and so on. And the interesting thing about it is that when you look at the details of a certain beer, there are similar beers that can be used as recommendations. What I wanted to do for demonstration was to have a list of recommendations brought to me automatically, depending on and according to the beers that I checked in, that I registered on Untapped as I went along. So here's an example of a beer I had yesterday in Beer Nouveau. And as you can see, the similar beers, Flat White, Doubling Up, You're in the Jungle Baby, etc., they appear now in a workflow user task that's assigned to me, and I can see it in my global inbox in my Fiori Launchpad. I can have a look at the individual recommendations here and say, okay, well, I would like to put on my wish list for next time Doubling Up and Outer Limits, for example. And I can hit continue. This would be the equivalent of hitting approve or reject or other workflow actions. And then once I hit continue, that workflow item, of course, has then been complete as far as me as a processor is concerned. And the result of that, which we'll have a look at shortly, is that those two recommended beers that I chose have now been added to my nominal wish list here. I checked in Salacia Barrel Aged, and I selected as my recommendations the Doubling Up and Outer Limits. So you can see that that is the result of me selecting those. So now it's time to take a look behind the scenes and see how the workflow service supports this whole process. It's deliberately a relatively simple process, but nevertheless it will allow us to have a look at many of the aspects, many of the features of the workflow service itself. Workflow definitions can be built within the SAP Web Ide, and you need for that in your settings to turn on the workflow editor feature. So I've already got that turned on. That gives you the ability to use a graphical editor to define your workflows in the Web Ide. As you can see here, I've got two projects in my Discovering SAP Workflow workspace, which is a new feature of the Web Ide. I can keep things nicely organized. We're going to look first of all at the projects relating directly to the workflow definition itself. The workflow definition is this thing here, untapped recommendation.workflow. In fact, you'll see that if I double click and we'll open that, there we go, you can see that that relates to exactly to this. Elsewhere in here, we'll come across these two files shortly. There's a script, Marshall Selected Recommendations, which we'll briefly look at there. And there's also some sample data, which we'll come across also shortly. Let me close those two for now. So a workflow definition can consist of a number of flows. This is a really simple single flow from start all the way through to end. There are also, however, gateways that you can use to control the flow of execution and so on. I'm not doing that here. And there are in total 4 different types of tasks. User tasks, which is exactly relating to the user tasks that appear in my inbox, which we saw earlier. There are service tasks, which allow us to connect to and interact with remote services via those services APIs, which we'll look at shortly as well. There are script tasks, which enable us to write JavaScript within the context of a workflow instance execution, and that JavaScript can be used to access the context, the data relating to that specific workflow instance. And we've got an example of that here. And there's also, since a few weeks, a mail task, which allows us, of course, as you can guess, to send mail. We haven't got one of those in here, but that's really doesn't matter. Let's start with the user task. We have a definition called present recommendations, or the definition ID is user task 1, present recommendations is the title, and the detail is really where it's at. This is a user task, and the user task should be shown in, or this particular user task should be shown in the inbox workflow log. The details of this user task, we have a priority, we have a subject. That subject is built from some static strings, but also some information from the context within the workflow instance itself. When the workflow instance is initiated, a data payload can be sent, and that data payload then is stored within the workflow instance context, which can be then subsequently manipulated, for example, and information, properties read from that and used accordingly. So the title of the workflow task, in fact, if I just initiate a new example of this particular untapped recommendation definition, you can see here I've got some sample data. This sample data comes exactly from what sample data I've entered here in this file. So you can define your sample data if you want to start manually some workflows to test with. So I'm going to start a new instance here. So then we should see that, if we refresh, we should see that instance here. Subliminal is another beer, for example. So we have present recommendations. We have you recently checked into Subliminal by Books and Brewery. Here are some beer recommendations for your wish list, and so on. Let's relate that, and also the recommended beers similar to Subliminal. Let's relate that to what we see here. So we have here, for example, recommended beers similar to Subliminal, and then here's the description. You recently checked into this beer by this brewery, etc., etc. For the purposes of demonstration and for the purposes of what I wanted to do here, I'm just assigning any workflow user task in this definition to me. That's me with my personal ID. I don't have a particular due date configured for this user task, so it can never go overdue. I do have a boundary event, which we'll look at shortly, which enables me to avoid my inbox being clogged up with all sorts of recommendations for all sorts of different beers if I haven't bothered to visit my inbox and choose those recommendations. So they'll expire effectively. We'll look at that shortly. So if we continue to look at the present recommendations user task, a user task has a user interface, and the user interface is exactly what's shown in the detail of this particular My Inbox app. So the My Inbox app is almost like a skeleton app. It's a framework app that comes as standard, and you can have different, or this app supports different user tasks from different workflow definitions. For example, it might be an expense approval item workflow where you're the approver and you have a completely different user interface to look at the expenses that are being requested to be approved and then approve or reject them as appropriate, and so on. So every single user task needs, of course, a display and a way for the person, the recipient of the workflow user task, to have a look and make a decision. So this is me having a look at the individual recommended beers and making a decision in terms of I'd like to continue with the ones I've selected in this particular case. So you define your user interface as an HTML5 UI5 powered app that then fits inside and is run within the context of the My Inbox workflow app itself. The actual approval app here, Untapped Recommendation Approval, is actually this other project up here, which I've already written and deployed to the SAP Cloud Platform. So it's available from the Fiori Launchpad and from within the My Inbox mechanism. Okay, so that is the user task itself. If we then go further and have a look at the boundary timer event, what I've done here is, like I just mentioned before, said, well, I might drink a few beers on an afternoon, and I might not get round to having a look at the recommendations, and I don't want those recommendations and those inbox items remaining in my inbox forever. So I want them to expire after a certain amount of time. the certain amount of time in this particular example for this demonstration is 5 minutes, so that maybe we'll see them expire and see them disappear during the course of this demonstration, which will be nice. So you can define your boundary event duration based upon a static value, like 5 minutes in this case, or you can build expressions or due dates and so on. What happens if the boundary timer is met? Then I have another flow which goes to an end event, which will terminate the running instance. And of course, a terminated instance will no longer appear or be in my inbox. Now, it's not been 5 minutes yet, so if I press refresh, it should still be there. That's great. Okay, so that was the user task. To demonstrate a script task, as you remember, you've got user task, a little person here. This is a script task, as you can see here. To demonstrate the use of a script task, I have a script task within the flow here. So as soon as I, in this case, have chosen some beers that have been recommended to me and press continue, the workflow continues, the flow of that workflow instance continues. And we end up in the Marshall selections script task. We have a look at the Marshall selected recommendations script itself. All it does is manipulate, I'm not going to go through the details of this, but all it does is manipulate the data within the context of the workflow instance so that we can use it in the next step where we use a service task to send the chosen recommendations to an external service. Okay, so that's what this particular bit of JavaScript does in this example. So let's flip back to there. So once that script task is completed, then the workflow moves on to the next and final, well, penultimate step. The final step, I guess, is the end event. It moves on to the next task, which is a service task. This service task is the one that I'm using to write the data to my made up wish list, which is just a Firebase JSON document here, which I've chosen because it's very visual and it's very easy to see when things have been added. Okay, so there's a particular check-in, and there's a particular check-in and selected set of data that we did right at the start of the demonstration. The details of the service task are here. So we have a destination, which is defined, of course, in the Cloud Platform cockpit itself, and as you can see, the destination definition is untapped wishlist store, and the untapped wishlist store, which is quite hard to say, let's scroll down here, you'll see it. Untapped wishlist store is just the endpoint that's exposed for my untapped recommendations Firebase database. Okay, so that's the destination. I'm sending the data, I'm posting the data to an endpoint, relative endpoint called wishlist.json, which will make it appear inside of this particular node in the JSON hierarchy. And what am I sending? Well, I'm sending the wishlist entry property within the context of this particular workflow instance. If we remember in the Marshall selections script, in our script task, we're actually creating the wishlist entry property in the context here. So that's exactly what the Marshall selected recommendations script task is doing. It's gathering together and organizing the data to be in the right shape for me to send to the external service, which is here. And that's it. That is the definition of the workflow. And in the workflow, we've seen step 1, which is a user task. We have a boundary event associated with that. Step 2, which is a script task. And step 3 is a service task. Okay, so far so good. Okay, now that we've had an overview of the workflow definition itself, let's go end to end through the whole process. So I have here a spreadsheet, a Google Apps sheet of data that's automatically built up from a mechanism I've written with Google Apps Script that polls the data in Untapped for me using the Untapped API, and then writes every check-in to a row in the spreadsheet. I also have then within the Google Apps Script the ability to take each of these check-in rows and create for every new check-in that it sees, it creates an instance, a new instance of the untapped recommendation workflow definition. Now, of course, right now, the latest check-in ID that was processed is something ending in 874, which is exactly this last one here. So it's all up to date. But for the purposes of demonstration, I'm going to use a little facility I've built here with a custom menu check-ins. I'm going to reset the latest check-in to that one so that we have two new ones for which we can have recommendations sent, as in we can have workflow instances created. So I'll reset the latest check-ins. So the latest check-in is now 868, so we have two more. And I will, in a second, cause those recommendations to be sent. Normally this is scheduled on a timer basis, but I've stopped that schedule right now for the purposes of demonstration, and I'm just triggering it instead from this little menu item that I've created. But before we do that, in our look at the user task, we looked at the boundary timer event, which is where we defined a static value of 5 minutes. And after that 5 minutes, if we're still hanging around the user task, the entire workflow instance is cancelled. So if we go to my inbox and hit refresh, I think it's been more than 5 minutes now because I had a pause between recording, and this should disappear. Yeah, it's disappeared. It's been cancelled because the boundary timer event was reached. So now it's time we can actually add these two new check-ins, new quote-unquote new, and create two new workflow instances, one for each of the check-ins. So the first one is the number 1 bourbon barley wine, and the second one was Salacia barrel aged. Okay, so I'll send the recommendations. What that is doing is using the workflow API, the workflow service API itself, to create two new workflow instances of the untapped recommendation workflow definition. So if we now look in our, well, in fact, let's go to home, and we should see, yeah, there are two tasks in my inbox. So if we load my inbox, we'll see those tasks, and they relate directly to the workflow instances that I've just created. Specifically, of course, these are the user tasks, as in these are the present recommendations user tasks of the two workflow instances. So the next thing I'll do is I'll have a look at these here, and I'll choose, for example, flat white and doubling up and grandma's cooking recipes. Hit continue. That means that this user task is then complete and it should disappear, and then the Martian selections and the store in wish list parts of the workflow should flow on. Before I do hit continue, I'm going to look at or use the excellent workflow monitor app, which is available through two tiles normally, monitor workflows and from a workflow definition perspective, and monitor workflows from a workflow instances perspective. I'm going to look at the workflow definitions first of all, and I've deliberately cut down and kept this really simple, so you can see I've got two workflow definitions in this particular Cloud Platform account. I've got this little Mickey Mouse one here, and I've got the untapped recommendation workflow instance. We've seen this already when I said start new instance. We had the sample data that was presented to us, which we can use to initiate a new workflow instance with. We're not going to do that this time. Instead, I'm going to ask it to take me to the instance view for the workflow definition untapped recommendation, and we should see those two instances, those two workflow instances here in the monitor, and we do. So if we look at this one, for example, here's the Salacia barrel aged. We're looking at that one right now, and that's this one here. For every workflow instance in the Monitor Workflows app, we can see all sorts of information. We can see the fact that it's related to this definition ID, this workflow definition, untapped recommendation. Every instance has a unique ID. Every instance is an instance of a specific version of the workflow definition. You can see I've been playing around with this workflow definition for a while now, especially because I've been building it up for my Discovering SAP Workflows blog post series. It was started today, which is the time I'm recording this, And we can see any error messages. We don't have any error messages. We can see the entire workflow context, which is a new feature or relatively new feature of the Monitor Workflows app, which is great. And we can also jump down and see the execution log. And as you can imagine, nothing really much is to see here. We can see that the workflow was initiated first of all, and we can also see that the user task, recommended beer similar to Salacia barrel aged, is now available, and that relates directly to this user task here. We can also have a look at the tasks specifically here. So here are the user tasks, and this is, I can assign it to a different processor, for example. But let's go back and continue to look at this particular instance here. So there's the execution log. That's great. I could terminate the instance. I could suspend it and then resume it later, for example. But let's not do that. Okay, so that is where we are with this particular instance. Let's go back and hit continue. What should happen next is that the Marshall selections should kick in, and then the store in wish list should kick in as well. So let's just continue. That then causes the user task to disappear from my inbox. And if we look now at the Monitor Workflows, we can refresh that. Look at the execution log, and we can now see that these are the two items in the execution log we saw before. Then we can see that I completed that user task. Then we can see the start and then the successful completion of the script task, Marshall selections. That script task, of course, as we saw, is this thing here. And then we can see the start and successful completion of the store in wishlist service task, which is this thing here, to the destination untapped wishlist store, posting the payload, which is the wishlist entry, which should be marshalling here, to this particular relative resource. And we can see that there, the service endpoint was untapped wishlist store, and then because everything was fine, the workflow instance itself completed successfully. So in fact, if we can see the status here completed, if we now hit refresh, we can see both have disappeared. The other one's disappeared because of the 5-minute boundary timer. Of course, what we can also see here is the result of me choosing those 3 recommended beers. They've been added to the wish list. So there was the first one that we did right at the start of this demonstration, where I'd selected doubling up and outer limits. But here's the new one that you probably noticed appeared as an appended item to the wish list here in my make-believe recommendation wish list. And this one, in this case, I'd selected flat white, doubling up, and the grandma's cooking recipes. So there we go. That's the end-to-end process of the workflow definition untapped recommendation. So finally, let's have a quick look now at what one needs to get started with the workflow service. So what we'll do is we'll go to the Cloud Platform cockpit, and this is what we were looking at before. This is the destination untapped wishlist store for our service task. Let's move to the services area of the cockpit to have a look at all the services that I have at my disposal. And if I filter for integration, we'll see all sorts of different things, one of which is the workflow service. So if I select the workflow service, you can see that I've enabled it already, obviously. And in the take action section, there's a number of different things. We'll look at configure service shortly. The first thing that you need is the SAP Web Ide full stack version, and that's this thing here that we've been seeing the whole time. I've just refreshed that before just to make sure that I was still authenticated. And notice it's the full stack version, so you can always tell between the full stack and the original version of the SAP Web Ide by the fact that this has got CP on the end of it. So you need the full stack version of the SAP Web Ide to be able to define workflow definitions here. And you also need, of course, a Fiori Launchpad. And specifically, you need the default site, or the Fiori Launchpad site that you've defined as default. So that specifically is, in my case, this default site here, which I've been using for various experiments. So when you define a Fiori Launchpad site within the Cloud Platform portal, as it I think says here as well, yes, the prerequisites to using the workflow service are the portal service and the full stack Web IDE service. Within the portal service, you can define a Fiori Launchpad site. You can say that that site, I think the first one you create anyway, I think is the default one. You can specify that a site is the default site, and within your site, you can then go and find the 3 tiles that you'll want to manipulate and deal with workflow mechanisms, instances and definitions. There's the My Inbox tile, and there are the 2 tiles that allow us to use the workflow monitor to look at definition from a definitions perspective and an instances perspective. You can see I've already got these tiles pinned to my home. So those are these 3 tiles here. There's the My Inbox tile, there's the monitor workflow via workflow definitions tile, and there's the monitor workflows via workflow instances tile. So those are effectively the 3 things that you need to participate and use and take advantage of the workflow service in the SAP Cloud Platform. So let's just go now to take a brief look at the final couple of things inside the workflow service available in the cockpit. The first is the service configuration. So let's select the service configuration. There are no destinations that you need specifically. The destination that we use for the service task in our untapped recommendation workflow definition was a regular, let's call it a global destination rather than a service specific destination. But roles is something you'll need to and want to have a look at. The workflow service itself defines a number of different roles. You can see those roles here, type predefined. There's a message sender, a workflow developer, administration, and so on. So you will need to work out who in your organization needs to do what from a workflow perspective, for example, and a workflow participant. The workflow participant role, as an example, is or needs to be assigned to anyone who participates in, as in, for example, receives and processes user tasks in workflow instances. For purposes of learning about the workflow service and demonstrating it, I've assigned myself, P48110, to all of these different roles here. And if we go back again to the workflow service itself, the final link in Take Action is the View APIs link, which is really important, and it's definitely worth having a look at, even if you're not a programmer or a developer. This takes us to the SAP Cloud Platform workflow service API definitions and within the API hub. And you can look at the artifacts and look at the documentation for the workflow API, which is a very rich API already. And you can see that there are API resources and methods available for manipulating user tasks, for manipulating workflow definitions, workflow instances, and all sorts of other different things. So that is the workflow API, and the initiation of workflow instances in this particular example here was done by a Google Apps script, which is related to this spreadsheet here, and the initiation used the workflow API. In particular, it used the workflow instances resources, and I posted, as in I created new workflow instances using this exact API call. Okay,